Yeah, no, I was taking one after lunch, and then if I took another one, like, I'm not sleeping that night.
Hello everybody, I hope you can hear me well. It's wonderful to see so many of you. Welcome to this RDV seminar on transnational anti-gender movements. As some of you know, RDV seminars are a collaboration between the Center for Discretion and Paternalism and the University of Bergen, Law Transform. But this event is also part of the cross-disciplinary course in Sex and Politics in a Global Perspective, organized by the Queer Research Group, Law Transform, and the Center for Women and Gender Research. I'm very glad and honored to introduce you to two fantastic people. My dear friend Yndira Soares, who is a PhD candidate in political science from the University of Pelotas, currently a guest researcher at UIB and at Law Transform, and Neil Datta, who welcome to Bergen, who just came to Bergen, who is the executive director and creator of the European Parliamentary Forum on Sexual and Reproductive Rights. Yndira will start with a presentation, chronological and spatial account on how these movements took more and more power and built alliances. And later, Neil is going to give us a presentation on a more current update on how these movements are evolving, what is going to change with Trump 2.0 with the new presidency. And the latter part of the presentation will be just the audience and the panel interacting. So if you have any questions, you can keep them, take some notes, and then our panelists will be very ready to answer. My name is Andrea, and I will moderate the discussion, but for now I'm just going to leave the floor to the panelists. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Do you guys hear me well? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yndira. Thank you so much for being here today, and also thank you, Andrea, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to me to share this panel with Neil Datta. And today I'm going to talk about the transnational feminist counter-movements in the international arena. Well, globally, opposition to gender equality is gaining strength, driven in part by the aftermath of the global financial crisis and austerity measures in the early 2000 years. These shifts have empowered conservative organizations and states, contributing to a broader democratic decline. Many countries are seeing a weak in their democracies, in their liberal democracies, marked by declining political participation, eroding trust in institutions, and also the collapse of traditional party systems. This shrink in civic spaces directly impacts on human rights, particularly on gender policies. Feminist activism face increasing restrictions, while gender-based violence is on the rise. The erosion of democracy isn't just a national issue. It's unfolding at a transnational level. To fully understand the anti-gender movements, we must look beyond these domestic politics, because its roots extend far beyond individual states, with key influences tracing back to the Vatican. This anti-feminist alliance has become increasingly organized, involving different actors such as states, conservative NGOs, the Vatican, regional groups like the Arab League and the G7. And these groups unite to defend the natural family and to oppose to the so-called gender ideology. Their primary strategy involves using rhetoric to neutralize feminist and queer social movements and to gain ideological control over the concept of gender. Advocates of this perspective view the family as a cornerstone of discipline and authority. The family is responsible for education, including higher education, as well as the health and well-being of the children. They see this dependence relationship as a natural component of constructing a well-regulated free society rooted in moral values. Concerned with the state costs of new families structures, these thinkers argue for the restoration of the traditional family to take on social responsibilities. Since 2004, the presence of countries at the UN's International Day of the Family and the International Year of the Family has grown. Additionally, in 2008, conservative NGOs formalized the UN Family Rights Caucus, and 7 years later, 25 UN member states formed the group of Friends and Family. The World Family Congresses, including the World Congresses of Families, have been held since 1997 and gaining greater prominence in 2012. Counter-movements have adopted strategies similar to the flexible network used by feminist movements. In doing so, they have shared values and information by producing newsletters, UN-related documents, event calendars, and reports. And like social movements, the counter-movements' agendas are diverse, and they have also had to build consensus to form coalitions and to advance their causes. In this case, to block or maintain the status quo. At the UN, these actors seek to influence language and documents, pushing for terms like natural and fundamental to define women and families. They also attempt to exclude feminist movements from the decision-making process and lobby with hesitant nations on gender issues. These counter-movements act in spaces like Human Rights Council and the Commission on the Status of Women, where they aim to define the family in traditional terms, impacting not only the concept of family, but also the equality of rights among the family's members. It is important to highlight that leaders like Katalin Novak of Hungary and Angela Hernandez of Colombia have spearheaded campaigns against gender ideology, both nationally and regionally. Activists like Obaniju Ekoa of Nigeria have criticized international donors for imposing agendas, equating them with neocolonialism and view gender ideology as a form of colonization and a threat to natural sovereignty. The Holy See, for instance, during the Beijing conference, argued that feminism did not necessarily represent Western women, but rather a minority trying to impose its views on all women. These initiatives provoke resentment against Western liberalism and colonialism, with conservative rhetoric framing feminism as a form of cultural imperialism. In Latin America, since the 2010s, the region has undergone a political shift, characterized by the removal of the center-left governments and the decline of the pink tide, reflecting a broader global trends. Latin American countries are experiencing great political instability, religious conservatism and neoliberalism, and many countries share a tendency to overlook human rights policies and international threats that protect sexual and reproductive rights. In these contexts, gender-related disputes have moved beyond the legislative sphere. As demonstrated by 2016 peace agreement between the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC, and Colombia, in 2018 elections in Brazil and Costa Rica, and the opposition to gender parity in political participation in Paraguay. Anti-gender campaigns have also been recorded in Mexico, Chile, Uruguay, Bolivia, and Ecuador. At the international level, and in some cases regional, the Organization of American States has become a site of gender contestation as well. Since 2013, anti-gender movements have influenced deliberations such as the Guatemala General Assembly, where they oppose conventions against discriminations and intolerance. Regarding the Organization of American States, the influence of the Spanish Orange Organization, Citizen can be observed. The organization launched a campaign through its Freedom Bus against trans people, with the slogan, "Leave the children alone, como hijos no se metan." Also, there is a coalition of other organizations, such as Cia la Vida and Asociación La Familia Importa, and the International Catholic and Anti-Abortion Organization, Human Life International. It is important to note that in both institutions, the UN and the Organization of American States, the Vatican, through the representation of the Pope, has the status of a permanent observer. In terms of popular support and street participation, it is clear that since 2016, these groups have mobilized to challenge policies on sexual education, legal marriage, adoption by the same gender couples, and constitutional decisions. These campaigns have been notably led by evangelical groups, with a strong presence of female leaders, such as the Colombia Congresswoman Ángela Hernández, with support from conservative Catholics. Latin America heads of governments have welcomed the Catholic Church's involvement in political discussions, seeing alliances or dialogue with the Catholic Church as a source of political gain. Along with religious actors, business organizations, landowners, and military staff, they play a noticeable role during election periods, actively engaging in the legislative arena. It is also crucial to recognize that the region still carries authoritarian legacies, which contribute to the fragility and limitations of its democracies, make social transformation on human rights more difficult. For example, in Brazil, the ex-president Bolsonaro, a former military officer, declared in his first speech that he would combat gender ideology, incorporating it into the agenda of the newly created Ministry of Women, Family and Human Rights, as well as in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Education. Opposition to gender issues had evolved into anti-democratic and anti-liberal policies from governments with strong popular support, where conservatism allies with ultra-liberal economist agendas. This reflects, for instance, not only setbacks in the normative and institutional gender agenda, but also an increase in the murder of female leaders, the criminalization of indigenous community, judicial persecution, and selective repression in protests. The most emblematic case, which exemplifies the new enemy and what we must be fought, and this is my finish line, is the murder of the Brazilian councilwoman Marielle Franco in 2018, a black, lesbian, woman from Favela da Maré. Tu sentar aqui.
Okay. Thank you very much, Yndira. I guess now it's my turn. Thank you, Andrea, for the introduction. As was mentioned, I'm the executive director of EPF, which is the European Parliamentary Forum for Sexual and Reproductive Rights. My main job is to work with politicians to advance sexual and reproductive health and rights. So that means access to contraception, abortion rights, maternal health, etc. So that's the main thing. But over the past 10, 15 years, we've come across this phenomenon in Europe which contests these rights. Anti-abortion, anti-women's rights, anti-LGBTQ. And as I was saying in discussions over lunch with Siri, I've developed a rather strange hobby where I've been looking into these groups and trying to figure out how they work. I published a few reports on these, and I was very happy to present them here in Bergen, and now we're in the process of updating these reports, and I'm presenting you sort of advanced findings from how this movement has developed, at least in a European setting. So it's not as wide-ranging as what Yndira just presented, but this really concentrates on Europe. So let's see. Voila. Okay. So I'll be taking a look at 5 main things. Anti-gender funding in Europe, the 5 dimensions of anti-gender activism, the implications of what is happening in the United States, because that is very important for sexual reproductive health and rights and broadly authoritarianism, and then just some concluding thoughts. Okay. So as I mentioned, we had produced a report in 2021 entitled Tip of the Iceberg, which looked at the funding behind the way that the anti-gender movement was organized in Europe. And by anti-gender movement, I'm really taking a look at those actors in society who contest everything related to sexual reproductive health and rights, so abortion, contraception, assisted procreation, but also LGBTQI rights, children's rights, for example, comprehensive sexuality education, advanced homeschooling, contest also child protection services and things like that. Gender, just the word gender mainstreaming, GBV, usually just the word gender can provoke an allergic reaction within this group of people. And then also advance the notion of liberty, and specifically religious liberty or freedom of speech, as being a higher order of human right or freedom than other types of human rights, such as a woman's right to access healthcare or an LGBT person to be protected from non-discrimination. So that's a group of things I'm looking at. In our previous report, we had found that there was at least $700 million going into this anti-gender movement in Europe, covering the period 2009 to 2018. When we take a look at the sample of organizations covering a more recent period, 2018 to 22, we find that there's many more organizations active in this space, and that the amount of funding has very much increased. In the past 5 years, we're looking at least $880 million. So the amount of funding going into the anti-gender activism space would have more than doubled over the past 5 years. What this means is that we find more organizations. They're active in more geographies. A couple of years ago, we would not have included the Nordic countries or the Western Balkans in this set. Now they're very much present here as well. Also, they're growing stronger and wealthier, so that even in countries where they were well established, we see that they're getting wealthier and growing as organizations. And also there's new types of organizations that I'll get into. So I'll take a look at it through 5 different dimensions: religious, civil society, politics, knowledge production, and geopolitics. We start with the religious because the concept of gender ideology really is a Catholic invention to describe all the ills of the world after the human rights conferences of the 1990s of Cairo on population and Beijing on women, where they suffered a big loss, and then they attributed this to to this nefarious gender ideology, which doesn't exist. It's a descriptive for what they don't like in society. But we'll start with religious, and then we'll go to the other ones. So again, looking only at Europe, okay, what we find is that the main religious denominations and hierarchies present on the European continent have all gotten equally more socially conservative and have called on their adherents to become more politically engaged. We see this very clearly with the Catholics, with coming out with a number of documents, Dignitas Infinita, that was about a year ago, Laudato Si, and which is really a call to the Catholics to organize and be active, defending the social doctrine of the Catholic Church. With the Protestants, there I'm talking mainly about the small communities of traditionalist Protestants, not the mainstream Protestant religions, but there's like, you have a Bible Belt here in Norway, you know this. There's a Bible Belt in many of the main Protestant countries. That's who I'm talking about. So they also are becoming more socially conservative, but the biggest change has really been within the Orthodox countries. This anti-gender ideology was first picked up by the Russian Orthodox Church, exported primarily to the Serbian and Romanian Orthodox Church. Over the past 5 years, we find all the Orthodox churches in Eastern Europe, or where there's Christian Orthodoxy, even going so far as Ethiopia, being much more engaged in contesting gender equality and human rights. And so basically, growing social conservatism and a call for greater political engagement coming from all the religious hierarchies. Next, in terms of civil society, this used to be the epicenter of anti-gender activism, and it's mainly what Yndira was talking about, how they're active in different international spaces. Here what we see is that there's some innovations, and two specifically I want to point out. One, when we take a look at some of these civil society organizations, some of them appear to be a bit fishy, and which led us to the idea of maybe having to describe them with another name, and we're going with the concept of church-organized NGOs. Because when you see these NGOs, they are legally registered as such, they appear as such and go into the world as a civil society organization, but when you scratch beneath the surface, what you find is that looking at their statutes, their funding, their executive committees and all of this, they're basically the extension of a religious hierarchy, okay? And their role is to advance the political aims of the religious hierarchy, which makes them different from a faith-based organization, which would be religious people getting together, sharing a common bond of faith to do something, usually services, okay? Caritas, Brood voor die Welt, and things like this are good examples. They produce something for the common good for everyone. These organizations are there to do lobbying and advocacy. Another new aspect of civil society are what we are calling anti-gender services. So that these organizations, they're not simply content to contest abortion rights or access to family planning or LGBT rights. One thing that they have developed over the past 10 years is a seemingly credible alternative to sexual and reproductive health services. So you have all of this list of things there. If you don't like comprehensive sexuality education, there's this one program called Teen Star, which is sex and relationship education for young people. But when you take a look at this, it's basically an abstinence until marriage program. Okay, fertility treatments are specifically problematic for some Catholic institutions and people because of the use of multiple embryos. Well, there's NAPRO technologies, which is basically a way of systematizing regular sexual intercourse, but in a way to maximize open fertility periods. And you have the reverse of this, natural family planning, which is the same system, but to not fall pregnant. And one of them, the FEM app, you see the thing in light purple, that's been so well crafted in terms of vocabulary that it has secured a €400,000 grant from the European Union in order to develop and then spread itself around the world as a fertility tracking app, which would be an alternative to contraception. Next is the world of politics. Okay, I would say that the world of politics is really now the new epicenter of the anti-gender activism space. Some evolutions have taken place here. First is that where this sits in terms of the world of politics in Europe. About 10-15 years ago, the primary allies of anti-gender activism were to be found within the big family of the European People's Party. So that's the Christian Democrats around Europe. Think of Angela Merkel, those types of political parties. They were good allies because most of them were inspired by the social doctrine of the Catholic Church, hence the name Christian Democrat. But they were not very ambitious, and they were mainstream political parties, and eventually they had to follow the evolutions in society. Remember, in Germany, it was the CDU that allowed for a free vote on equal marriage. Okay, so then the anti-gender actors had to find better, more ambitious allies, and so we see a gravitation towards the far-right populist parties of Europe, okay, or whatever you call them in the different countries. But we're talking Vox in Spain, AfD in Germany, Vlaams-Belang in Belgium. In Netherlands, there's too many, and they're very ephemeral to count. Or Sweden Democrats, Fratelli d'Italia. In Italy, you have a lot. You have a good many of them. Fratelli d'Italia, La Lega. Those are the ones. So those are the ones who are really carrying this now. And then one thing that's emerged also is the appearance of transnational, politically oriented networks. So we have a certain number of them. There's a National Conservatism Conference, Political Network for Values, and then also the Conservative Political Action Committee, which all bring together these types of people. This is a picture in the Spanish Senate of last December 2024, so just a few weeks ago, really, of the Political Network for Values. They are the main network that strategizes specifically against gender issues. So they have a strategy against abortion, against LGBT rights, etc. And we can see there who are the sponsors of this. So you have there a whole number of different organizations, that some of them are being tracked by Yndira, but you have the Heritage Foundation from the United States. You have this one with that weird tree in green and red. That's the political foundation for the Fidesz political party of Viktor Orban in Hungary. You then have Ordo Juris from Poland. They're the Polish organization behind all the anti-LGBT free zones, the abortion restrictions, etc. And then you have also some think tanks, which I'll get to in a bit later. But you see all the different actors coming together to discuss, strategize a political agenda on this issue. And this is not just the only one. There's, as I said, at least two more. A new category of actor which has really emerged in Europe over, I would say, the past 5-7 years is that of think tanks. And now with think tanks, we can categorize them broadly into two main categories. Okay. First are the think tanks that have emerged as a consequence of the electoral success of far-right political parties, where in a certain number of countries, once they reach a certain threshold, they get public funding, and in some cases, additional public funding to create a political think tank. Okay, think of the German system. I'm sure most of you have become familiar with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and things like this. You have this system in different countries. And so there we have a certain number of think tanks that have emerged, such as Fundación Dissenso, affiliated with the Vox party. You have this one from, at EU level, Salix, associated with the European Christian political movement. The other category of think tanks are Hungarian government-funded think tanks. Okay, so these are people close to the Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who then take over a foundation, and then this foundation then funds or creates a think tank. There's several of them. One of them is the Center for Fundamental Rights. Another one is MCC, the Matthias Corvinus College, which is a bit like an anti-gender, ultra-conservative version of the Central European University that used to be in Budapest. Okay, they've set up an office in Brussels which acts as a think tank. We can see a little bit what type of knowledge do they produce. So this is only since 2023, some of the cover pages of their reports. So we can see there, sexualizing children. That's one against comprehensive sexuality education. Somehow they've discovered that the LGBTQ have taken over the EU institutions, so they've released a report about this. Families in Fragment. And then another one, interesting for you also, they actually hosted a discussion about how Hungary should break the EU consensus on sexual and reproductive health and rights in UN negotiations. So it's rather sophisticated what they're doing. Okay. Next, in terms of geopolitics, what we see over the past couple of years also is that European anti-gender organizations have globalized and have internationalized. Okay, we knew this of the U.S. organizations. The U.S. Christian Right, we know, has been active all around the world and specifically Africa for the better part of 20 years. And even if you go back in your memory and you remember in 2013-14, there was this piece of legislation in Uganda called Kill the Gays Bill. That was largely attributed to U.S. Evangelicals coming over to Uganda, spreading their word, and then things like that happen. Now we have Europeans doing the same thing. Okay, and several types of them. These are the names of some of the different organizations, but we also have European states being involved in this. Hungary is one of them, where Hungary's development aid is nearly entirely focused on supporting the issue of persecuted Christians. Persecuted Christians means any Christian who feels that they're a victim of gender ideology. Okay, so it's very focused on this. Russia also uses the concept of colonial imposition of gender ideology in its relations at a geopolitical space in order to create a wedge between certain states and their Western backers. If we take a look then at Uganda, now Uganda adopted in 2023, I believe, this anti-homosexuality bill. Okay, and it's been the news coverage about this bill in Uganda has been usually that it's some bad Americans, namely Sharon Slater from Family Watch International, who traveled to Kampala, organized meetings, and convinced the Ugandans to do this bill, and then that's how it became law. But I would suggest the situation is a bit more complex. So we know that there's that American input into what happened in Uganda. But if we take a look further, we also see that Uganda had signed way back in 2022, something like this Geneva Consensus Declaration, this Trump-era fake UN document asserting that there is no right to abortion in international law. Okay. There's an implementation mechanism for this Geneva Consensus Declaration called Protego. There's the anti-LGBT legislation, which I just mentioned. The Wall Street Journal revealed in September 2024 that it was the Russian embassy in Kampala which funded a parliamentarians' conference in Uganda, bringing together MPs from all the neighboring African countries and in the Ugandan parliament to discuss all of these things. And then from there, we see the anti-LGBT bill being adopted, and then similar anti-gender issues appearing in Zambia, Kenya, Tanzania. We also have a Vatican-related group inside the Ugandan parliament called International Catholic Legislators Network, which has its own secretariat, which works very closely with Hungary, and Hungary took over the secretariat of the Geneva Consensus Declaration when Biden won. So if we take a look at the situation in Uganda, we have Ugandan actors. They voted almost unanimously in favor of this anti-LGBT law. We have European actors, American actors. We have the footprint of the Russians, the Vatican, and Hungary in its own right. So we have all of this mosaic of different actors all pushing in the same way, but maybe with slightly different reasons, which have then produced the situation that we know of in Uganda. I'll take a look at the Trump administration now, okay, because I think this is a very important thing in understanding where things are with sexual reproductive health and rights. Now, there is so much happening coming over from Washington and the US that I will only concentrate on the impact on sexual reproductive health and rights, okay? And I've been working in this field for 25 years, so I've lived through 2 presidencies of George W. Bush and 1 previous presidency of Trump. So we knew some things, we could anticipate some things from when the Republicans take over, but this is very different. And so I've divided it into 3 phases: destruction, consolidation, and creation. But maybe just a few things about how things are different this time around. First, we knew that funding cuts were going to come for the field of sexual reproductive health and rights. Okay, that's a standard with any Republican administration since 1984. Okay. One big difference here is that already before the US elections, it's about half of the big donor countries in Europe, they were already in a process of downsizing their own development aid for reasons which are purely internal to them. Okay, Belgium just did this, Netherlands, Germany is going to do this, France, etc. So already in 2017, there was a big reaction from European donors to fill the gap left by the withdrawal of the United States. It's not happening now. Okay. Also, this time around, as you know, Trump really won. He has a clear mandate, whereas in the previous one, he had a technical win at the Electoral College, not the popular vote. So there was room to contest that legitimacy. Also, Europe now needs the United States as a result of NATO and Ukraine. You've been watching recent developments as much as I have, so I won't say anything more about this. And then also we have our own far-right movement very much aligned with MAGA in the United States. So we know that whatever happens in the United States could happen to any one of us within 1 or 2 election cycles. Okay. And then also I would say a 5th one is that now we have a well-developed alternative anti-gender services infrastructure, which we did not have in the past. Okay. So what does that mean? So in terms of phase 1, the destruction phase, okay, so we see that basically, well, we knew that all NGOs working in sexual reproductive health and rights were going to lose their funding, okay, that's already happened. What we did not expect was the stop work orders, which basically freezes the spending of US money immediately, okay, and now there's the dismantlement of USAID. So this is rather unexpected, so that this means that the funding is even greater than anticipated. USAID as a development agency is the largest in the world, accounting for about $70 billion. That's gone. And from what I understand of colleagues in Washington, it's not coming back anytime soon. Oh. Okay. And there's also destruction of infrastructure inside the United States. There's talks about dismantling the Department of Education. National Endowment for Democracy also limits the possibility to have democratic checks within the United States. So we have all of this destruction happening now, and it's a certain chaos which is deliberate, and I think we need to understand this. It's what Steve Bannon called flooding the zone, or what Naomi Klein called the shock therapy, but it's definitely, there's a certain deliberate aspect to it. There's also a part of it which is just chaotic chaos. You know, it's there's different movements happening in Washington. So destruction. Next, what I anticipate, and we already see it happening, is the consolidation phase, where the US administration opposition to sexual reproductive health and rights will manifest itself in many different ways. We're already hearing reports about this, how this is happening in terms of the boards of UN Women, UNICEF, and just recently the World Food Programme, about demands to remove DEI, diversity, equality, and inclusion, remove references to gender or gender, because by this they think it means gender ideology, from working documents of UN agencies. I think the next thing that will happen will be that the US will use the Geneva Consensus document to consolidate a set of alliances in order to promote this type of thinking at different UN settings. So there's a 30-year celebration or commemoration of the Beijing Platform of Action at the CSW, at the Commission on the Status of Women, coming up in March. And then there's further UN meetings that will take place. I think we need to anticipate a very robust US diplomacy against sexual reproductive health and rights in all these different settings. And then 2 other areas I would say that we need to watch for. One is that of religious freedom, This was a pet project of Vice President Mike Pence back in the day, as I said, to assert religious freedom as a higher uber human right above all the other human rights, specifically access to health, access to non-discrimination, etc. And Vice President J.D. Vance has already said he wants to pick this up as one of his things during his vice presidency. And then perhaps a dark horse there that we need to watch for is the issue of demography. Elon Musk is convinced that the human race is headed towards population collapse and that we need to make more babies. He's reportedly the financial backer of this initiative called XY Worldwide, which is headed by former President Katalin Novak of Hungary, with the support of Giorgia Meloni, which is to look at the issues of demography and to promote demographic growth. So I think we need to understand what all of this could mean in terms of the oncoming diplomacy. And I wrote this maybe 2 weeks ago, saying that I think we need to anticipate alignment with authoritarian illiberal regimes. I didn't expect to be right so soon, but you're seeing the news yourself. And then finally, creation. Okay, here we go back to these anti-gender services that I've mentioned earlier. Underneath the Geneva Consensus Declaration, there's a specific program called Protigo, Women's Optimal Health Framework, WOOF. And this 70-page document outlines how countries can implement this WOOF, this Optimal Health Framework. And within that, it creates space for all of these anti-gender programs. Now, what we're hearing from the US is that USAID will probably shrink from an agency employing 13,000 people down to one of about 300 to 400 people. With that, you don't have the human resources to implement big projects yourself. What you can do is hire project managers to then oversee money that you give to other people. And I suspect that this is what could happen, but I don't know. I'm looking into my crystal ball, to be honest. But the leftover money from USAID and some of it going to the State Department could then go on to these types of programs. And if you take a look at what is happening with US diplomacy now, I would not be surprised to hear that a condition of accepting USAID support would be to implement these types of programs, but then also only these types of programs, and not evidence-based sexuality education, not actual family planning, which would pose a very problematic situation for countries like Norway, the EU, for the UN agencies, which are all active in this space. So I think that's something that we need to look out for in the next couple of months. My anticipation is that we'll start seeing this perhaps in the early summer. And so the cumulative effect of the Trump on anti-gender actions in terms of destruction, sexual reproductive health and rights programs around the world will close and are closed. Okay, massive funding losses, so to the point that there's not even a calculation that's possible. Just as one example, USAID accounts for approximately 1/3 of all the donated contraceptives in the world. Okay, mainly in the global south. This has, so USAID was doing this. This was outside of the budget of the countries it was going to. Okay, so in Uganda, they would get contraceptives, or Uganda, Malawi, Bangladesh, whatever, they would get contraceptives from USAID, but they don't know how much they cost. And so how do these countries even start to program the financing to replace this? Not to mention the technical expertise in terms of procurement, etc. So the massive disruption in terms of in the destruction phase. Then in terms of consolidation, diplomatic turbulences at the level of the UN. I would say we also need to take a look at the influence of the US in terms of appointment of UN officials, and then also changing the mandates of UN agencies. And then finally, the creation, that of having a whole category of fake anti-gender false services to replace sexual reproductive health and rights. So next steps in terms of what we can do, these are just really broad thoughts, but I've been speaking for a long time, to bring on board many different new types of allies in terms of the thinking around this. And I think the many different dimensions I've pointed out shows that there needs to be expertise from different fields coming into thinking this. Another thing is that a lot of the response to this anti-gender activism has focused on communications work and reframing. I think we need to move very far beyond that and to actually consider, what it is that we need to do in terms of this new ecosystem that has emerged in Europe, which is that of knowledge production. Also, to take a look at some of our blind spots, many people looking in terms of sexual reproductive health and rights will take a look at democracy, public health, etc. But demography is a very much a blind spot. Religious freedom, many people working in the space don't feel that comfortable with religion. And then also the whole thing that's been growing right under our noses, which are anti-gender services. We need some robust analysis of these things. And we need to look into targeted strategies to counter specific anti-gender components, such as, like what should we be doing to challenge the legitimacy of chongos? And then finally, the anti-gender are very good at exploiting the divisions within progressive circles. And three main divisions that they're really exploiting now, that of different points of view on surrogacy, sex work / prostitution, and then also trans rights. And this may vary according to different countries, but there are legitimate differences on all of these issues. But one aspect of this is that the anti-gender organizations know this and they're exploiting this in order to meet their own broader objectives. And we'll be coming out with, in fact, 2 new reports, one next week, which looks at specifically the impact of the Trump administration, which will go into more detail of what I've presented today. And then the big report that will be coming out, I'm hoping in May, which we're tentatively entitling The Next Wave, which will look into the funding behind all of this movement that I've been talking about. So thank you very much for your attention. It's 10 to 3.
Oh,
40
okay.
minutes.
Thank you very much. Okay, I believe there will be many questions. It was also much interesting. So I will just use my rights and start with one. Actually, it made me curious because you slightly mentioned the Nordic region and how it's a new terrain for all this anti-gender funding. And since we're in Norway, I wanted to ask you, because, coming maybe from my personal experience, my perception is that this anti-gender discourse and politics in general, at least in Norway, is not as much relegated, for example, as in my country or Italy or other European countries, and that's partly the reason why I left. So I wanted to ask you, do you think they're actually going to root more, or is there some factors, whether institutional, societal, cultural, that maybe is going to stop or maybe fuel even more these narratives and anti-gender politics in the Nordic region? I know we cannot generalize, maybe if you have some specific example, Norway, Sweden.
So as I mentioned a number of years ago, it was in 2017. Roman Kuhar, David Paternot came out with a book called Anti-Gender Campaigns in Europe. And there they took a look at 13 countries. They took an initial look at all the Nordic countries, couldn't find anything, and then just moved on. Okay. Now there's stuff happening in these countries. Okay. Compared to your country of Italy, it's baby stuff. Okay. But it's still happening, and it can grow quickly. Okay. I think we need to see that my theory for how this happens is that in every country there are people who feel this way. Okay, they want to connect with others who will help them in advancing their goals, and so you have Norwegians, Swedes, Danes, Finns, etc. trying to advance these types of things. And they will use different entry points. One of the entry points that I think that they're using in Nordic countries is debates around trans rights. Okay, that would be one entry point that they're using. We also find that there's some collaboration between Norwegian actors and this one actor in the United Kingdom that tries to offer reintegrative therapy, which is a new form of gay conversion therapy. It's gay conversion therapy light, okay, which tries to repair the individual rather than to convert them. But we know that they've already had some contacts with people here in Norway, and then also there's been other actors who have been present or interacting in Norway on the issue of child protection services, and they're contesting the role of the state. So there are certain entry points that they are using, and they're looking to they're fishing around to see for what works and what can gain traction.
Thank you very much. I think we can move to the audience. There's a magic box that we always use, so don't fight for who takes the first question. But
thank you, all three of you. Great introductions, great presentations. I think I think the comments you made about Norway are very on point, and I think it's incredibly important to see the kind of entry points, the sort of slow creeping entry points, and I think you're right. Both the trans and the sort of family value agenda is where it's going to come, and I just for all my Norwegian here who is voting in the upcoming elections, you want to notice the changes in the Christian Party, and very nice people, rock artists like Dag Inge Ulstein, and who's now touting this family value line. This is kind of scary stuff, and I just really just want to. And what I find is very interesting is also among young people how it's not really, they don't take their necessarily frustration and anger from their own day-to-day life. They find it somewhere else, online, so they associate with sort of right-wing movements in America or somewhere else. So this sort of, it's so globalized. And I think that's what we really kind of need to be wary about. So I'm more nervous than you are, to be really honest with you. Neil, maybe to all three, I have a very personal question. You worked on this through so many, 2 Bushes, 2 Trumps. You worked on this for so long. What do you do to just stay afloat? What keeps you getting up in the morning and not just getting completely knocked down? I mean, I really need your advice on this one. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, I at least in terms of researching this, I think I have a certain ability to remain somewhat distant from it, because I've seen this with many other people. When they look into this, they take it very personally, and it sucks the life and energy out of them. Somehow I have perhaps a rather perverse personality where I'm able to remain somewhat abstract from it. Secondly, I like the work that we do is a bit different from many others, where we take a look really at organizations, we get to know them, and we take a look at how they function. And I think this gives us a different reading of the organizations, where a lot of the other research focuses on narratives or broader developments or things like that. So I think that's perhaps a different thing. But then also, after the elections in November in the United States, I was very depressed for about 3 weeks. I think in part because I was able to predict what was going to happen. Okay, and we were discussing at lunch. I mean, it looks like we're in the early stages, the flashback moments of The Handmaid's Tale, where Gilead is being set up. Except the Gilead will not be the austere one from the movies. It will be some sort of mixed with Las Vegas and kitsch, and gold and stuff like that. So, but it looks like that's what we're heading towards. And then also, it's good to be able to provide answers to people who are trying to figure all of this out. But then also to abstract to take away from it. Then I've started learning Hindi and I go to the gym a lot.
Thank you.
Very useful. You also go to the gym.
I go to the gym, it's not helping.
Yeah, so speaking of Norway and speaking of organizations, so the Christian Democrats were mentioned and the far right were mentioned. Are there like other organizations like NGOs, for example, dedicated to spreading this ideology in Norway or in the Nordic countries?
What we found is that in the Nordic countries, the civil society actors, they're present, but they are minuscule. Okay, and they may not be very well organized at the moment, but they're still there. I know that there was some sort of group of apparently former gays who welcomed this reintegrative therapy thing here in Norway, in Oslo. Then you had this weird pastor Jan Åge Torp, who was popular for a certain while. Now he's broadly irrelevant. And so you have things that appear every now and then disappear. I would say that in countries like Norway, it would be more the discourse that then seeps into a certain part of the political class. And if I compare with two other countries, we can see that it has this type of discourse has really taken root inside the Sweden Democrats. So there we have a political party that's taken this up. And I think over the past 10, 15 years, it's the different elements of the Sweden Democrats that have made at least 15 attempts to change the Swedish abortion law. Mm-hmm. Okay, so they try. They're not successful, but they are trying there. And then another country which I think could be useful as a comparison is the Netherlands, which is equally affluent, progressive, and there we have an offshoot of this Polish organization Ordo Juris, which set up in the Netherlands. There they're called Civitas Christiana, and they were able to build up their presence over a couple of years, and then they launched a massive campaign against comprehensive sexuality education and against LGBT rights, equating that with pedophilia, and it gained a lot of traction in the public, so that everyone was very, very spooked in the Netherlands. And so I think, to me, that's a cautionary tale of how these types of movements can pick up even in a progressive country which is not predominantly Catholic and which prides itself on its openness to sexuality and the LGBT issues. They were able to have some traction there. So I think we need to remain vigilant here. But it's here in Norway, it's embryonic.
So thank you so much, both, or all three of you. I want to sort of, so the title of the seminar today is sort of what's happening at the international level, and you both spoke to that. And I want to get back to that because I mean it's fascinating the way in which you were both sort of drawing up this, the way in which these organizations have been working both at the UN level and at the European level. At the same time, one of the things that seem to be happening from the US now is, in a way, to make these institutions much more irrelevant. So many of the organizations where these so I just wanted to throw that into it. Is that also what we're seeing now? And will that have some influence on the strategies? So not so much at the UN level, but so maybe it will be more important, but maybe not on this stage. So I just want you to reflect, both of you, on these dynamics and what we're seeing here, because in some ways you could also say that what we're seeing now is the end of international human rights law. And if it is, what does that mean for what's happening and for the work that both the pro and the anti organizations are doing at the international level? And then I also wanted to push you a little bit, maybe both of you, on I think it was really important, and I'm going to think a lot about it, the points of sort of what do we need to work on, how can we try to work in this context. And I also wanted to sort of, some of this obviously also applies to the international level, but I wanted you to also think about this beyond the national context, but also sort of how can we think about it more at the international level. Just a small question.
Yeah. So in terms of the international institutions, a few thoughts come to mind. One is that we see from a number of the different anti-gender actors a dual approach towards international institutions. On the one hand, they try to engage with them legitimately. Usually that doesn't work. Once they've exhausted this, then they challenge the legitimacy of the very institution. And we can see this very clearly in reports that they themselves have come out. There's one organization based in Strasbourg called the European Center for Law and Justice, which is the European version of the American Center for Law and Justice, whose head was the lawyer for President Trump during his first impeachment. So just to give an example of the access and level that they have. They engage in lawfare at the European Court of Human Rights, but then they've also come out with a report on how all of the judges of the European Court of Human Rights are agents of Soros. Okay, so you have that dual engagement. With the and one more recent, just from a few weeks ago, the U.S. withdrew from the World Health Organization. What we hear informally is that when the WHO DG asked the U.S. ambassador, is there any way that the U.S. could come back? The answer was that, well, we could consider it if WHO signs the Geneva Consensus Declaration. Okay, so it's exactly, and this is what we're seeing with the recent reports coming out from the boards of UN Women, UNICEF, World Food Programme. So I think that's, but then in terms of international human rights law, this is something that I've been saying within our sector we need to give some serious thought to. In those areas where the US is now withdrawn, those can remain spaces where we can make advances without the US. So World Health Assembly is there, UN, the Human Rights Council, we can continue working there. But in other settings where the US will be there, we need to be realistic. There will not be any advances at the CSW this year or at CPD or any of these things. And I think we need to calculate this and make sure that we position ourselves appropriately so that we don't register defeats either, because it's not just not advancing, but the defeat on our side also matters. So I think we need to be very strategic in how we position ourselves there.
Just to add some with Neil said, that we see in these institutions this kind of appeal to sovereignty, but in the same way they are using those spaces like UN or other international organization to try to gain this normative, this conception, but in the same way to complain about those elites like Soros that you say, and also about these questions of these headquarters being in the US. That is one big problem because after Beijing, all of the conferences were held in New York City. What is difficult for feminists from Global South to attend, and on the other hand, in Geneva. So it's not that accessible to engage or to have a force to block these counter movements. And also, I guess we can try to support, I don't know, to politicize young people, as we've seen as these elections in Germany, because yes, it was awful, but we also seen the left and the expression that they gain from TikTok and other social medias, especially the voters were young people, and they gained the election in Berlin. So I think it is a hope in a certain way of like this. I don't know. Yeah, optimism. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Dr. Karan. It was really nice to see your presentation, particularly highlighting issues pertaining to sexual health and reproductive rights, and the phases you mentioned about deconstruction and then consolidation and sort of construction. Or should I perhaps try sharing my thoughts in Hindi, if you would prefer it? आपका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद जो आपने आज प्रेजेंटेशन दी. मैं बहुत प्रोत्साहित हूँगा अगर आप भारतीय पर्सपेक्टिव को भी थोड़ा इसमें इन्वॉल्व करें. मैं यह बता सकता हूँ कि भारत में एक वेव सी चल रही है कि एक अवेयरनेस स्प्रेड करने की कोशिश करी जा रही है. अगर आप सोशल मीडिया देखें, चलचित्र मूवीज़ देखें, लोग बहुत ही कंसर्न्ड हैं रिप्रोडक्टिव राइट्स, मेंस्ट्रुअल हाइजीन और इन सब संबंधित विषयों पर. तो सरकार जो है, जो गवर्नमेंट है, वो अलग अलग भांति प्रकार के स्कीम्स इंट्रोड्यूस कर रही है. एक निरोध स्कीम है जो कि स्पेसिफिकली रिप्रोडक्टिव राइट्स पे फोकस करती है, कॉन्ट्रासेप्टिव्स पे. तो अंत में मैं यही कहना चाहूँगा कि बहुत अच्छा लगा आपको सुन के, आपके प्रेजेंटेशन सुन के, एंड मैं बहुत इच्छुक हूँ कि मैं आपकी रिपोर्ट जो कि आने वाली है, डिटेल्ड कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव रिपोर्ट, वो मैं पढ़ सकूँ. धन्यवाद.
धन्यवाद. My Hindi is not that advanced. So maybe I can ask you to repeat the question in English so that everybody else can understand. Although I understood perfectly.
I just was thanking you for your presentation and taking our attention to these important topics. I somewhere suggested that the Indian perspective on this issue is quite interesting to be looked at. If you look at the government focus, including the focus of social media and awareness, you will find that there are movies that are being made dedicated to menstrual hygiene, reproductive rights, which is not so common usually. But there is a sort of awareness that is there between or within the electorate, and these are very crucial electoral issues on which one can make or lose the government. So government is also dedicatedly working on these issues, which sometimes other people laugh about. Say for instance, hygiene, sanitation, menstrual hygiene, contraceptives. But I look forward to your comprehensive report that is going to come very soon. That's what I said in Hindi. Thank you.
Thank you. And also, if I can just comment on that. Yeah, what's interesting is that we see this movement trying to take root in India, which is rather interesting because this movement is really based on a substrate of Christian thinking. Okay, in India there are some Christians, but I mean it's broadly not the prevailing culture, and so it will be interesting to see if and how it does take root there. But it does look like some elements of this are being used by those politicians with a more authoritarian orientation. And also, we do see that there has been, in some states, some local groups that have emerged which contest mainly LGBT rights and mainly the rights of gay and lesbians. Transgender, interestingly, in India, has a different type of acceptance as a result of its place in religion. But so it will be interesting to see if this manages to leap such a very profound cultural divide.
It's really very interesting. Even if you look at the judicial pronouncements pertaining to transgender issues, you see it's very interesting narrative.
So this is sort of a quick follow-up to this discussion of the electoral politics. And so far we've been discussing it as if it's a single axis issue, like gender, SRHR. And my curiosity is, how are these parties or segments co-opting typically left-wing issues, right, environmental issues, and aligning them with anti-gender rhetoric in order to sort of build the coalition and make it even stronger? Is that happening?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Some thoughts on that. We see that, at least from some of the Catholic thinking, they have come up with their own environmental approaches to certain things. So we have this thing called écologie intégrale, in French, integral ecology, which is the Catholic way of how to be environmental. Okay, and that includes being anti-abortion, because we need to protect all life from the moment of conception. So they have a Catholic green alternative that they're able to offer. We also see that in some countries there's the emergence, not always successful, but of what some are calling a conservative left, which is that of political parties which emerge from the left, okay, which really are there to promote the interests of workers or the disenfranchised classes, and they don't want any of this nonsense of gender ideology. That's, you know, for a certain elite or bourgeois classes. And one good example of that was the Sarah Wagenknecht Bündnis, which didn't make it, was not as successful as anticipated in Germany. But you have Fico in Slovakia, who's meant to be in the same line. So I think that's something that we need to take a look at.
And thank you, both of you, or all three, for really interesting lectures and discussions. I just wanted to go back to, I'm in a mode that I want to think about like what we can actually do about these things. And you had, Neil, this slide when you were talking about different strategies that you thought it was good to use. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about like this when you talk about the media and communication strategies to move beyond narratives and reframing to consider gender knowledge, anti-gender knowledge production. And the way I understood you here, it's kind of like analyzing how now the think tanks are working to produce a different kind of knowledge. But I'm not quite sure if I got the kind of like reframing and narratives kind of, if that's different. But I also wanted to point in that direction, because we haven't, none of you had mentioned that, is how you mobilize this kind of like anti-gender discourse. But what is mobilized a lot, at least in Europe and the US, is you mobilize it through anti-woke. And that's the kind of new lingo that will make a lot of people not want to say stuff because you don't want to be woke, in a sense, kind of. And that cuts across so many different things, like both like religion, but political difference and stuff like that. And I was so struck when I watched Debatten on Norwegian television, which is this twice weekly debate forum, and when they had a lot of different politicians, and they were going to talk about like what the consequences were in Norway for Trump's cutting back on US aid and Dodge system and stuff like that. And none of them, except for one, very shortly answered a question about gender and diversity. They all talked about like aid, and we have to continue to give aid, and they talked about spending on military defense and what they're going to do. But it's like no one even wanted to touch the theme of gender and diversity. And I was wondering if that has to do with a really kind of anti-woke sentiment and how that is being mobilized, maybe through these think tanks, or maybe, I don't know. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
In terms of the reframing and narratives, what I mentioned this because what I see, at least in the civil society space, is that when they're confronted with this anti-gender activism, they're often being asked, well, you know, like, how can we help you by funders, okay? And, you know, like, you know, this women's group or this family planning organization is being challenged and they face really a very tough time. And this impacts services and their ability to do work, and so what can we do? And very often the answer from these organizations is not so much what needs to be done overall, but it then becomes what can they do specifically. And so then it becomes reduced down to something manageable for their organization, which is understandable. And then a lot of this is reframing advocacy, reframing narratives work, which is basically a nice way of saying communications workshops. Okay. Now, all of us here, we will always benefit from an additional communications workshop. It sharpens our skills, but it's not necessarily a strategic response to what needs to be done. We need to do something much more ambitious. And so this is why I think we need to be taking a look at what the think tanks are doing, because that gives us an idea, an insight, you know, from that original, from whatever reports are producing. This gives us an insight into what will become advocacy initiatives a year down the line. Okay, so if they're working on demography, we need to take a look at what they're saying and beef up our own understanding of demographic issues. Okay, if they're talking about the role of the family and the EU, we need to get our heads around this and be able to defend our positions in that context. So that's what I think we need to be doing. Also separately, I think another thing that I think we should be doing is actually challenging the legitimacy of some of these organizations. For example, the church organized NGOs that I mentioned, one of them was successful, one of them got so far as to have the Italian presidency of the G7 produce a formal suggestion to the G7 group of countries that they should create a subgroup on the family. This happened just in 2024, okay? And that this subgroup of the G7 states, which would be staffed by officials from, you know, all the ministries from the G7, the secretariat of this should be done by a specific civil society organization called FAFSE, the Federation for Catholic Family Associations in Europe. When you take a look at who's behind this organization, it's not Catholic family associations around Europe. It is the marriage counseling outreach of church dioceses in most different countries, or some Catholic religious movements. So if the G7 had done this, it's basically inviting the Vatican to the G7 table. Now, if they want to do this, fine, okay? But they should do this knowingly. And I think if we understand this, then we need to challenge the legitimacy of certain groups so that we really can show who they are. That's another aspect of what I think we should be doing beyond communications work.
So I'm now looking, because I already had a go, so if anybody, because time is running out, so if you're burning with a question, but otherwise, in a way it's to follow up what you just said, and something that we talked about earlier. So, because I am really, really sort of interested in these structural differences between the different sides. Because you said, sort of, there is something about the organizations working to advance sexual and reproductive rights, whether at UN or not, that it's very much working on a project basis. So it's vulnerable, and it's always and it's fragile in a different way. While the organizations that are church outreaches, they have a deep funding that they have a long term, and that's I think if we look at this is different, but if we look at the organizations trying to change the judiciary in the US, I mean, really sort of organizing to have courses, law schools, new jurisprudence and so on. It's long term. I mean, they're playing a very long game. And and I think there is something about, they might look like the same. They might look like similar organizations at the UN or elsewhere, but it's actually very different. It's actually really, really different structures. So at the organization level, but also at the ideological level, that in a way they have a coherent, not quite, but they have a quite coherent body of thinking, that they have a long-term goal also in terms of ideology that aligns, and where sexual and reproductive rights and family and the coherence of the family and limited state and all of this goes together, so they can have views on child protection, they can have views on abortion, they can have views on comprehensive sex education and on trans rights, and they all align, so they can have they can build around it. But on the other side, we have very different groups working on each of these issues, and some of them under the radar with no groups working. So there is something there, and is there a way? Do you have any? You must have given a lot of thought to this. Do you have any? And actually, both of you must have given thought to this. Is there something about the coherence of? Is there a way to build a more coherent structure, a more robust organizational and ideological resistance or whatever on the other side?
My thoughts on this are that what you've described is very accurate, and myself, coming from the specific world of sexual reproductive health and rights, I can see how this community and then also related communities work very much in project-oriented silos, okay, which are dependent on very limited funding, although some funding, it's usually in the form of project, but it's renewed regularly, so it is long-term, but it's very much siloed. I think we need to realize that we may be close to being in the same state as the other side was in the mid-1990s when they suffered their defeat. Okay? And I think we need to reconfigure and reconceptualize what it is that we're doing, because the world that we have created over the past couple of years is being dismantled. Okay? I mean, if we just think about sexual reproductive health and rights and the departure and the dismantlement of USAID, we don't have access to contraception if 1/3 of the supply is gone overnight, okay? And this impacts all of us. Here, not contraceptive supply in Norway, but Norway as a donor country and being able to meet its SDGs and all of that. So I think we need to realize this, and my thinking is that maybe one pole around which we could reconfigure ourselves is that of democracy and rule of law, because that is really the thing that we need to defend at the moment in the face of rising authoritarianism. And this is the thing, sexual reproductive health and rights in its broad sense, gender equality, LGBT, is the thing that's being used to unstitch the different components of democracy and rule of law. These are my personal thinking.
I think we have time for one more question.
So I have one question. As you mentioned, I'm just thinking about this effect of social media too. As Yndira mentioned, of course, you have this these effects of transnational or challenging the boundaries of the frontiers, this cosmopolitan fact. And I'm thinking about, for example, this trend of trad wife in social media. That's very, very much a mobilizing factor, I will say. And is very, I was thinking, for example, as of different gender, I would say gender norms in certain countries. I was thinking how to connect that, for example, to the fact that, let's say, in Latin America, women compose most of the informal workforce, and these ideas of trad wife being on the rise again, of course, but also being glamorized, I will say, in social media. And one of the other question that I have is because Neil mentioned the Commission of the Status of Women that will take place in March, and I'm going to provocation. I'm going to just Yndira, if you can speak a little bit about what you're expecting for this commission, expectations, also look a little bit on your crystal ball, something. Thank you so much.
Well, about these trends in social media, as we see like this gay cure, we see a lot of nowadays. We see a lot of this feminism cure. Because I was a feminist, but now I am cure. I am a tried wife, and of course this is yeah. And in Latin America, it's crazy to thinking about it because we have a lot of absent fathers and a lot of solo mothers, and we see that work without receiving any payment from this work, and they are the most affected persons in this neoliberalism and ultra-conservatism policies. And they are people of color, and they are marginalized in society. So for me, it's not about the trend itself. It's not that appealing for them. It's more for them who those have money, you know. But for this other type of population, I guess the evangelical churches plays a way more appealing way of in the sense of to, how can I say, to engage or to embrace this woman and to build this community, you know. I don't know if you understand what I say. And also my expectations about CSW, it's screaming and confusion. No, but it's like I'm super excited in a certain way, and it was so difficult to get like the access to get there. So it's not that easy for civic society to access this. And also, well, it is in New York. I need to get a visa. I'm a Latina. So, yes, I got the visa after Trump's. Yeah, that was like, oh my God, how can I get this visa? But okay. And then I get, and I'm super excited to see what is going to happen, the discussions. And we are talking about, because I want to interview some of these conservative movements. Yes, and he is he's trying to help me. And yes, I'm like, I'm excited in a researcher way, you know, like, but as a person, not much. And also responding about this cooptation of movements that these conservative groups take from feminist movements. They use in part to create a, how can I say, to create a confusion in those meetings, like including the terms of gender, because even though for feminists gender is not a close concept, you know, for movements it's not this kind of general concept. And also they try to approach with those layers of society, you know, like the critic of globalization, and also like the elites, it's dominating the world, and colonialism, and some sort of that. So I don't know if I answer your question, but yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, I see just one more question.
Is there time? Yeah, thank you so much. And I think it's really good to feel the seriousness of this as well, and having a bit better insight. But thinking about the interdisciplinary nature of what's going on and how we might be able to work together, I think something that's really striking is that I don't hear much about a deep understanding of how humans develop over time. For example, develop consciousness through childhood, adolescence. I hear a lot about TikTok and its influences, media, pictures. We've got the next wave, and the word relates to the wave image, and that has its histories. But I was just thinking maybe it would be good to concentrate on theories about how humans develop actual consciousness. There's one guy working on a theory, radical plasticity thesis, Axel Clermans in Belgium for quite a few years now, which is a really fascinating way to see how do words and actions actually generate structures of consciousness, which then affect our perception, which then provide the mechanisms for manipulation and information and education. But through the lifespan, then they're dependent on ecological and theory of mind of others, so that you get the grouping of minds that have been developmentally trained to think in a particular way based on the concepts that's been introduced developmentally at different time points. And of course, the very, very harsh realities of the work about destructive plasticity, which Catherine Malabou has written about in France, that some of these actions, these are radical cellular actions upon people's minds and consciousnesses. And I think that some of that work might really be quite useful in both accompanying and looking at, the organizational structures, but what are these processes actually doing to the human being? Because those might be something that might be transversal between countries at a global level. So I just want to sort of share that thought that it would be really interesting to talk about that aspect together as well. Thank you, and thank you very much, because I know it was kind of over the time, but thank you.
Thank you for the comment. If you don't have anything more to add, do you? Have you?
Just a small thing. Thank you for that. That was really a very important contribution. Also, when I consider some of the anti-gender services which specifically target children and young people. So I think that would be an interesting dimension to bring into that. Then on the issue of tradwives, what I think is important is not so much the issue of tradwives, but to me what it says about how this anti-gender movement has invested in the space of mass communications. Okay? Because we see that they have gone straight into social media and they're much better at it than the progressive groups. Okay? You then compare this with the fact that we know that the social media now are skewed against these against progressive groups. They're in the hands of Musk, Zuckerbergs, who have all aligned themselves in a certain way. And then what we find also is in an increasing number of countries, the traditional media has been gobbled up by local oligarchs. Okay, so the whole media space now is somewhat skewed in favor of these anti-gender thinking actors, etc. So I think that's something also that we need to explore and understand and get our heads around to see what it is that we can do, because they're only recently there. It doesn't mean that they can that they need to stay there forever. Yep.
Okay.
We have one question from the chat, online chat.
Ah,
can we do it really quickly?
Yes.
So Vilde asks, what are some things we can do to fight anti-gender movements on a more local level? She specifies region and or city level.
Question of the year.
There is
a suggestion. Okay.
Those comes. That's the American approach.
I would suggest maybe making sure that there's education at local level for younger people about the importance of inclusion, diversity, and things like that. So that if people get this early, then it's more likely that that this will stay with them for a long time.
Yeah.
And also to be careful and maybe to be mindful, maybe to have some pedagogy or some education about how young people should be interacting and digesting social media so that they can develop some critical thinking, because they will be exposed to this. The parents won't see what the kids are doing on their phone, and so they need to develop their own way of filtering through all of this.
Yes, to discover a critical way to analyze what they are receiving, and also some regulation for me, I guess, some regulation of this media.
Perfect. So, no more questions. Thank you very, very, very much for the good discussions, and thank you all for the insightful questions which broaden the discussions even more.